My name is Cindy Kelly. I'm with the Atomic Heritage Foundation, and I'm in Oak Ridge, Tennessee today, which is Friday, September 6th, 2013. And we're very fortunate today to have Helen Jernigan. And I'm going to start by asking Helen to say her name and spell it.
Helen Jernigan, Helen Jernigan.
Very good. Helen is living in Oak Ridge, and she came here during the Manhattan Projects. But I want her to start and just tell us a little bit about where she was born, what her birth date was, and a little bit of her childhood before she got to Oak Ridge.
And I was born on July 31st, 1925, in Pleasant Hill, Tennessee, which is in Cumberland County, an almost adjoining county to Anderson, on the Cumberland Plateau, on a farm. And I was just finished my first year in college at Tennessee Wesleyan College in Athens, Tennessee, when I first came to Oak Ridge. And the reason I came here was with a folk dancing group from Pleasant Hill to entertain at the opening of the Happy Valley Theater. And the Happy Valley Theater was located at the site of the construction of K-25.
Can you describe Happy Valley?
It's almost beyond description. Happy Valley is almost beyond description. It was construction workers and trailers. They lived in trailers and perhaps some other small housing. But I lived in a dormitory, which they call barracks. I lived in barracks number 11. And this was inhabited by, it was an H-shaped building with men on one side, women on the other, no keys, no locks on the doors, no problems because the area was so heavily policed. There was no crime allowed, and I felt perfectly safe. A little confused because I didn't know where I was. I didn't know Oak Ridge, Tennessee. At that point, I didn't know that name. But I think the residents themselves, I believe, the construction workers, had named it Happy Valley, maybe sort of in sarcasm. I'm not sure. But it was Happy Valley, and it had 13,000 people living there. Bigger population than the city of Clinton. And Oak Ridge was further to the east, and of course the thing most people are familiar with, the history of the whole Oak Ridge project. But Happy Valley was just construction, which went on day and night, bright lights, spotlights on poles, and music blaring, and activity everywhere all the time.
So I'm following you, I'm watching you dance your folk dance, and then what happened?
Oh, when we came to perform, our fellow performers were Grand Ole Opry stars. And I don't remember all of them, but I remember Sam and Kirk McGee, the boys from Tennessee, guitar and mandolin, and they were an act that were famous for years, and they shared the stage with us. And I accompanied this team of folk dancers on a piano, which was conveniently there. This was a regular movie theater, and there were also, in addition to the theater, all the amenities were there. There was a post office, a bank, a supermarket, a drugstore, and the place where I later worked, based on our performance that night, I was offered a job. And I remember the contractor, subcontractor, who had offered the job had the management of these other facilities, the theater and the recreational facilities. The main recreational facility was called Coney Island, and it was an arcade where you, with basketball goals, and you shot rifles and won prizes, won teddy bears and won dolls and things like that. And our main prize, which I'll tell you later in the story, or maybe right now, was cigarettes. Cigarettes were rationed at that time, but not at Coney Island. We had plenty of cigarettes. And I later found out that they were black market cigarettes, and the FBI came and got my boss for trafficking in black market material. And by this time I was safely back in college, and not there, but I was young enough to be worried that the FBI would come after me somehow. That was a concern for a little while. The facilities were just amazing. There was a bowling alley and a duck pin alley and everything you needed in the city. So I never left except a couple of times to come to Jackson Square, which was like going to another city, another town. And it was interesting. And I had to have a badge to get, there was a checkpoint between Happy Valley and the main Oak Ridge.
So would you say it's about 10 miles between?
Yes, about 10 miles between Happy Valley and the main part of Oak Ridge.
So how long were you there?
Just for the summer at that first time. And then when I had finished the next year of college, I came back to work at K-25. The facilities were all gone. I mean, they had razed all the buildings, and it was just a peaceful area with a pond and fish and lilies, and it was unbelievable. At times I thought I had dreamed the whole earlier experience. It was so strange to see all that gone. And instead was the now administration building there and the huge K-25 building that's so famous.
That must have been a shock. I can't imagine.
And so that began my second phase in Oak Ridge, and now called in Oak Ridge. And I worked in the recreation department there, and Union Carbide Corporation managed that facility at that time and provided all kinds of recreation for all these young people who were inhabiting Oak Ridge. And we had horseback riding and golf and swimming and every activity you can imagine, horseshoes even. And part of my unofficial work in the recreation department there was to encourage this and to attend all these things. So I rode horses and played golf and all those things, sometimes grudgingly. Sometimes I didn't, it wasn't my thing, but I did it to encourage people. And I worked my main job was as editor of the Carbide Courier, which was the plant newspaper. And there were two of us that I was an associate editor. And you may have at other times heard of Thomas X.F. McCarthy, who was the actual editor at that time from Brooklyn, and loved being in Tennessee, as many people who were transplanted here learned to love it. So we were a weekly paper. We had to be printed in Knoxville, so we went to Knoxville every Friday and to print the Carbide Courier. And I should have brought a copy, but that was an interesting job that I had for several years. and lived in, I was single and lived in dormitories, various dormitories, increasingly closer to the center of town. So I wound up at Carlisle Hall, which was just right in the center of, near Jackson Square.
We should go back to Happy Valley a minute more. So there are 13,000 people there.
13,000.
Yeah.
Oh, I think.
And did you get to know any of the people, or were they families, or?
Yes, I didn't know any of the families. I just knew the single people at Happy Valley that I came in contact with, or those people who came and spent their money at Coney Island in the evenings, and dates were no problem. I mean, I had there were many men there, many young men. So after I finished my office work, which I was doing for the manager of the recreational facilities, I would go and help run the concessions and things like that. And then we closed at midnight, and then we'd go out dancing or something. That we had to go out of Oak Ridge, and in Rockwood there was a place called the Plantation Club, which I probably wouldn't set foot in now, but it was a fun place to go and have a couple of drinks and dance and things.
So we're now after midnight.
Yeah.
Midnight, and this club was a ways away. How did you get there?
Well, my dates had cars, and that's how we went there.
So this club was not on the reservation. Did you go by the?
Had to go outside the reservation. There was no. We did have dancing. We had dancing at K25, at Happy Valley, and just across the street from one of the dormitories, and live bands would come, and you know it was heaven for a single girl.
So what was the ratio? Were there more men than women, or women than men?
Well, probably men than women. Certainly, I believe so. A lot of the single women lived in the area and came in to work from the surrounding area. They didn't live, and then there were a lot of us single women who lived in dormitories here who were from other places. And I used to go home every weekend, or not every weekend, but occasionally. There were buses. Buses went everywhere, free buses.
So did you manage to hold out all of those years with all these men, or did you succumb?
I held out, and in later years, I moved into a house. Houses were for married people, but I joined a group of nurses who had been given special dispensation because they were nurses in a D house, which was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, nice house on Taylor Road in Oak Ridge. So I lived there with them for some years, and then I married.
Great. Mr. Jernigan?
No, I married Ed Fairstein, who was an electronics engineer, and we had 2 children, and then I married Harold Jernigan, who was also a native Tennessean, in 1972.
So, anyway, so how old were you when you first came to Happy Valley and were playing the piano that summer?
I was 19. While in Happy Valley, I had my 19th birthday. As a child, I had studied piano, and I majored in music and English and college at Tennessee Wesleyan College.
So both majors came in very handy for you.
Very handy. They came in very handy.
Can you said that during the time you were at Happy Valley that there was construction going 24 hours a day, and was there entertainment going 24 hours a day for people getting off shifts?
Entertainment stopped at midnight, but construction went on round the clock.
Was it close enough that when you were trying to sleep you could hear the banging or?
In recent years, I've pondered whether I could sleep through all this, and apparently I could, because I don't remember any insomnia from those years. Or maybe at 2 o'clock in the morning, maybe they turned the sound off. I'm not sure what happened, but it seemed to me, my perception was that this all. Certainly the lights part, it was lit all night long.
So what time did your shift start?
I'm sorry?
What time did you start work?
Well, so my starting time for work was varied. It was probably about 10 o'clock in the morning when I started. I was supposed to be a bookkeeper, which I had never really done, but they had to give me something to do besides Coney Island. So I kept rudimentary books and tried to keep my boss from paying out of his pocket. When deliveries would arrive, he'd reach for his billfold and I would say, no, we have a checkbook and you're not supposed to do that. So he cooperated.
Is this the same boss that was getting cigarettes on the black market?
Yes.
Aha. At any rate, so I just think it sounds like a lot of fun.
It was. It was lots of fun, and I like remembering it now, since people ask me about it, because there weren't many of us who lived at Happy Valley who wound up living in Oak Ridge. Apparently, all these construction workers may have gone to other jobs in other parts of the United States. And I'm sure they did not remain here, many of them. And as you know, Colleen Black and her family lived at K25. And they and maybe half a dozen people are the only people that I know who who actually lived at the K25 construction site in Happy Valley.
Of the 13,000. Yeah. Great. So then you finished another year of college.
Yeah.
Now that wasn't the end of it, but you just.
It was. We won't call it dropped out, but I didn't continue.
And they hired you back at Coney Island for the next year.
No.
Oh no.
No. This Coney Island was gone. All traces of Happy Valley were gone, and this was like a new place entirely, with all the new office buildings and the new large K25 famous horseshoe building, and it was like starting like I'd never been there.
Huh. And your dormitory was that in the east, what is now, well, the K25 area, or was it further away when you came back?
When the summer that I spent in K-25 in Happy Valley, there were several barracks at various locations. One was near the powerhouse, and there were, I don't know, perhaps 8 such dormitories. And actually I was progressively moved toward the center, which was the center of the commercial area in Coney Island.
Was it as big and developed as Coney Island?
When I came, oh no, it was just an office. It was in the administration for the recreation department in the main part of Oak Ridge was office buildings and administration building. And I worked, actually it was a smaller building called the Labor Relations Building. And that's where they did things like handling deferments for people who were about to be drafted or who were already drafted to work there, because it was such high priority that came first, and with all of the special engineering detachment people, they were administered from there as well, I think.
Do you remember if your office was beside the Labor Relations office, what were labor relations like in Oak Ridge?
They were, when I came, actually before I started to work for the Carbide Courier, I was in a small office handling deferments, the paperwork for draft deferments in that office, and there was a labor attorney who shared that office with me, and several other people who I suppose took care of union negotiations and matters of that kind.
Would you say, just from your observation, that things worked pretty smoothly, or were there tensions in the labor force?
I think not. Union recruiters were allowed to come inside our building, I remember, because I remember one particularly aggressive young woman following me into the restroom. But I think they were peaceful, and there certainly were no anything like union protests or strikes during that period, because everybody was so intent on helping bring the war to an end, whatever we were doing, that it was the relationship was harmonious. But there was a staff of, I'd say, about 5 people who were experts in labor relations, including the attorney that shared my office. But I think everything was quite peaceful. The only thing that they did want to recruit office members. I mean, people who were not actually doing physical kinds of labor.
Okay.
I was being so well treated that I didn't join the effort to organize the people in the office, although my sympathies are with labor.
Among the laborers were a number of Afro-Americans who were recruited for the project, I understand. Did you come in contact with the African-Americans that worked on the project, and how was that?
I didn't come in contact with African-American people, but at Happy Valley, I saw American Indian people who had been recruited from New Mexico, or that Southwest, as riggers. And riggers have to go in high places. And American Indians, I don't know if this is folklore or fact, but they are famed for being able to be in very high places without fear or and with excellent balance. So with that in mind, they had recruited all these American Indians, and they at night the young men, they were all like very young men, would say things to us girls. They'd say, "Me scalp 'em."
To try to scare you, huh?
And so it was all great fun.
Yes.
But
yes.
I don't remember many African American employees. I'd never thought of that before.
Well, you know, this is the first I've heard of Native Americans working at Oak Ridge. That's very, very interesting. Very interesting. Did they perform any ceremonial dances or music or?
They didn't perform any ceremonial dances or music. They mostly just romped through the area in their blue jeans and just like everybody else. But they stood out because of their appearance and because of their friendliness. They were very friendly.
Great, that's great. Were there any Hispanic that you can think of?
I don't remember any Hispanic people.
So you would say, what was the average age, or what was the mix of ages?
Those people who actually lived on the site were, I'd say, all under 30. They may have been as younger, the age range may have been younger than that. And the people who worked in our little recreational group at Coney Island and the bowling alley and the theater and all the workers who manned those activities were mostly teenagers. I believe that I was the oldest teenager in the group who worked for my boss, who managed the recreational facilities.
Were some of these other youngsters or teenagers children of construction workers?
No.
No?
Mr. Rue asked me to recruit some more from Pleasant Hill, Tennessee. So I did. I brought a cousin and her girlfriend there, and they came and worked there for that same summer. And so it was, and he had brought from his hometown, which was Shelbyville, between Nashville and Memphis. He had brought his son and several teenagers from there. So it didn't take much experience to do what we did.
So you basically sold tickets and ran the games and?
Yes, we sold tickets and ran the games.
And this lasted till about midnight, you say, every night?
Yes. It was well populated, too.
That's great. What about security clearance? Did you and your cousin and friends have to go through security clearance?
We all had to go through security clearance, and security was very strict. I had invited at one point friends from college to come and visit me, So I borrowed mattresses from empty rooms in the dormitory where I lived, or barracks they called it, and when the next day, I think the next day after they left, the people that I assumed and I believe were FBI people, some sort of security officers, came and said that I had moved government property. And I explained, but they said they were supposed to do that. They were supposed to charge me with moving government property. So I moved the government property back to the rooms where it belonged, those mattresses, 2 mattresses, and didn't have to go to jail.
Goodness.
That's,
wow.
security was very tight.
Indeed.
And when I came to work in Oak Ridge proper, my habits were such that I was not careful about having my badge all the time, and sometimes I would get all the way to work and not have my badge. So I was continually being scolded for not doing that. I finally shaped up, but it took a while to know that you must have your badge all the time.
So was, in addition to the FBI, there was also a military police force?
I'm not sure who these security people were. We just called them broadly the FBI because we knew that acronym. And we assumed that they didn't seem to be local guard type people. The guards mostly manned the gates, the respective gates, and they weren't inside. Military police, I think, were there sometimes. So it may have been military police, it may have been a different kind of security guard.
Were you aware of any people or any incidents where somebody was removed from the project because of you know, leaking secrets or whatever?
I knew one man at Happy Valley who was removed because of bootlegging. And perhaps he was removed for going armed, because in the ceiling of his car, he had a gun in there. And he suddenly disappeared. He lived in the barracks next to me, and I talked to him frequently. And suddenly he wasn't there anymore. And I think he did not anticipate departure. I think he was departed.
So it may have been the bootlegging, and also were arms not allowed?
No, arms certainly were not allowed. And neither were alcoholic beverages, and of course there are many stories about how people got alcoholic beverages from outside and smuggled them in, hidden in all sorts of places like baby diaper bags and things like that.
I didn't realize that either. So you didn't even have a weak beer available?
A what?
A beer or something?
No,
like that?
there was no beer.
Was that true for the entire reservation, the entire war?
It was true for the entire reservation, and also Clinton was dry, and so one had to go to Chattanooga or Oakdale, which is to the northwest of Oak Ridge, near Harriman, and they briefly had legal liquor there. So there were frequent trips to other places to transport whiskey. And I think that the stories about moonshine or homemade whiskey, I think with apologies to Denise, that didn't happen. We were getting regular whiskey and conventional brands from these places. This stuff that we brought in was not moonshine. That's a different story. There were people who made moonshine who lived in this area outside Oak Ridge, and once in a while somebody would show up with always a fruit jar. It had to be in a fruit jar to be conventional folkloric moonshine. But that was rare. Mostly these were regular whiskeys and wines.
Interesting. How about the chemists? Do you know of any chemists who were using laboratory alcohol to spike up a punch?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes. Some laboratory chemists were bringing home lab alcohol. And we mixed that with fruit juice and in a punch bowl and drank it, and we called it Purple Jesus. And it was lethal stuff, which I partook of that very, very cautiously.
That's probably why you're here. Yes.
While my liver's intact.
Indeed, yes. Can be dangerous. So, can you tell us more about your work then on the paper and the what kind of stories did the paper run?
Sports, a lot of sports stories, and messages from the Union Carbide management, and stories about events and they organized quickly. I think they were very wise in having a lot of recreational activities for these young people very quickly. And there were stories about the kinds of things you could learn or attend if you wanted to learn to play bridge or you wanted music appreciation, everything, many activities. And there were stories about them, and I did a column in the paper. I did book reviews, and I did interviews with management people, and somewhere along the way, it occurred to me that we shouldn't just be writing about managerial employees. So I think I broke the mold a little bit by interviewing a few regular people, but that hadn't happened before. So I was pleased that they would let me do that. That we did pretty much what we wanted to do with the paper, but it had to be reviewed by security before we printed it.
So what were some of the topics that were off limits that you couldn't write about?
Well, I reviewed a book called I don't remember, it was something in the Commissar, which was a book about socialism, communism. And I don't remember the content of the book, but somebody nixed that. But otherwise, I wrote about ordinary books, bestsellers, and things like that, and stories about a few human interest stories, pictures. Of course, we had a photographer assigned to us, and stories about the various components of the whole plant, whole K-25. K-25 was the name of the whole site, and the big building there was also referred to as the K-25 building because it was the cornerstone building, if you will. And so there were various departments that that we wrote about, the work that they did, never getting close to anything secretive, you know, the steam plant and the things that make a regular plant operate.
Were you impressed by the size of the operation and all the different facilities?
Yes.
Can you say that?
And
That?
most of us thought that it was a weapons manufacturer of some kind, but we were thinking bullets, and we were thinking missiles, and we were thinking, we of course did not think of what it was. But we were satisfied with that, and not too curious. We were satisfied with our impression that it was for the manufacture of weapons, probably some sort of, you know, bullet kind of weapons, and didn't inquire further. At least the people that I associated with, maybe others did have more curiosity, but that was enough. The fact that it was for the war effort and that we were doing something, and also it was remember, it was following the Depression. It not too long before, and people were glad to get jobs. I mean, there were many people who had the attitude of patriotism, but there were many people for whom it was the best job they ever had. So, and many people in that age group, it may have been the first job they ever had. So there was not a lot of curiosity and about what we were doing there.
And of course, any curiosity was discouraged.
Right. Never talked about it at parties or gatherings. Never talked. You just talked about what you were. You didn't talk about your day's work, but you were glad to be off work, like any young people, and that was it. I think the young engineers probably talked, maybe, of course, gave more thought to what we were doing, but they never talked about it in social situations.
So do you think that most people were pretty well adjusted, or can you remember examples of very young people away from home for the first time who might have been uneasy?
I think they were very well adjusted. Some of my girlfriends had sweethearts or even husbands overseas, and that when one of those GIs would come home on furlough, and they had to go. Some of them were not really sure they had made the right choice of boyfriends earlier, and I remember one roommate was reluctant to return to a place in Kentucky where her boyfriend was happily on furlough and waiting for her, and she was reluctant to go. She was having a good time in Oak Ridge and had met people she may have liked better.
So how did you feel when you learned that the atomic bomb was the product of all your work?
Oh, undiluted happiness.
Can you say that?
The thinking came later, when we began to think about what we had done. And I joined a group of people called Engineers and Scientists of Oak Ridge, I guess it was the name, Engineers and Scientists of Oak Ridge. And we were so idealistic that we were promoting world government beyond the League of Nations, which was the only worldwide organization for peace at that time. So we had regular meetings, and to show you how naive we were, we wrote a constitution for the world. And these were mostly scientists, engineers, and we continued to meet for several years and joined other groups nationally. And this was frowned upon by security because it sounded too much like communism for the managerial people, and was, so it sort of faded away. And I don't know the particulars of its fading away, but we ceased to meet, and some of the principals had moved to other jobs. So that was an important reaction to what we had done with the bombs.
So that was after the war?
That was after the war. My initial reactions when the bombs were dropped was relief and happiness that the war was over. No other thoughts at that time filled my mind, although when pictures of the Japanese victims began to come out, it was a sobering moment for many of us.
That's great. So if you look back over your life, how has the experience shaped your life in any way?
I'm not sure. Let me think about that. Perhaps the experience has shaped my life in that I likely would not have become acquainted with such a wide variety of people. And that certainly has been of value in my relationships with people throughout my life.
And you chose to stay here in Oak Ridge. That says something.
I liked the work I had done, and did not consider leaving Oak Ridge. There was no decision to stay in Oak Ridge. I had a job, and I enjoyed my job, and had subsequent jobs after the Carbide Courier. I left that job actually because the editor had gone on to another newspaper, and I assumed that I would assume the role of the editor instead of the associate. There were only two of us, but they gave it to a man. They were pretty chauvinistic at that time, very chauvinistic, I should say, and men were ruling. There's no doubt of that. So I was unhappy, and I left for another job. I went to another plant newspaper actually, briefly, to the ORNL newspaper, and then I had motorcycle accident. I was a passenger that injured my back and had to have extensive surgery, and I resigned because I didn't think it fair for them to go on without me when we had just started that paper, just had begun the ORNL. I don't remember what its name was, but and I thought, in fairness, I should go on to another job, which I did.
So did you stay in the field? Did you stay working as an adult later?
Yeah, I worked for the Oak Ridger for several years. As we had an action line column in the Oak Ridger called Ask Inky, and the Inky part was for incorporation, because this column started for citizen input and questions when we incorporated Oak Ridge, and it was Inky was spelled I-N-C-K-Y. And it was an action line column where people could call or write in and get answers to any kind of questions about local matters, if they had some problem with the electrical department or the traffic department or anything. Sometimes wildly inappropriate things, but it was fun, and I did that also, and covered the Oak Ridge City Council and the Anderson County School Board for the Oak Ridger for a while. Then I ran for public office and was the circuit court clerk for Anderson County for the remaining years of my employment, and served 3 terms as that elected official, and retired.
Fabulous. Great. Is there anything that I didn't ask about that I should have?
I don't think so. I can't. I'll think of it on the way home, of course.
Oh, yeah, think about it on the way home. Yeah.
But I don't believe so. This has all come to as a total surprise to me. The interest in Happy Valley, which I had was in a corner of my scrapbook, as it were. Which actually I have no scrapbook, a real scrapbook, but it was in the corner of my life that I thought, is that real? Did I do that? And never talked about it to people. I did begin, the first person I remember talking about it was with Colleen Black. And my next door neighbor, who is her sister, Joe Iacovino. And when I discovered that they used to live there, and Joe told me her stories as a little girl living there, they were the only contacts I had till people like you began to inquire about, begin to discover Happy Valley.
That is fun, yeah.
And it still has a dreamlike quality, you know, for me, because so much has happened, and so many years have gone by since then.
But your memories are pretty vivid.
Yes. I remember the names of my fellow teenage workers, and you know, I remember them individually and their characteristics. You know, I remember them as well as I do current people. And some of this has been brought about by people like you jogging my memory. So that has helped, and I've been asked by all kinds of people like the Lions Club and middle schools and all to speak. And at first I was even less cohesive than I am today, because I thought, well, how can I describe this? And I wrote for the museum, the Children's Museum book, These Are Our Voices.